Hello, my name is Jim Cracchiolo. I'm the director at Learning Your Function Incorporated, also known as Life Inc. Today, we are going to do a presentation entitled Behavior and How It Applies to Life. This is a great presentation to teach you the basics of behavioral theory, a lot of psychology underpinnings, and how you can apply it to your classroom and your individual students. This is part one of two parts. I do want you to take a break in between part one and part two. Part one is a lot of dense definitions and theory. Number two is applying all of that theory and definitions into scenarios. So we're going to share a screen here, and we are going to go ahead and get into the presentation. So, behavior and how it applies to life, part one, and this is presented by Life Inc. Just a couple of heads ups before we get real deep into the definitions and the theories of it all. Behavior is not a feeling, an emotion, or even a cognition. What that means is that when an individual exhibits behavior, it's not something that we attend to in a way that it's feeling or emotion. There's a very important piece to behavior that requires us to take a scientific background. We need to think of behavior as more of like a reflex. Okay. A reflex happens because it has been innately driven to happen. It is a response. It is a reflex. And if we treat it like that, it's a lot easier to make that behavior happen more often or less often. And we'll get into that. Behavior can trigger all of the above items. So when a behavior happens, you can have feelings towards it, sometimes positive, sometimes negative. You can have emotions towards it, sometimes love or hate. You can have thoughts about it as a cognition. But we need to make sure that when we move to change a behavior, that we are neutral and that we are consistent, because those will be your greatest allies. If we are not neutral in the behavior and we have a bias towards the individual, then unfortunately we'll have a more difficult time changing that behavior, more to either make it something that happens more often or something that happens less. Consistency is huge in terms of altering a behavior. We need to make sure that our actions are consistent, even if it seems like on the surface they are not working. We need to continue to fulfill a plan. We'll go over the parts of those plans, but it's important to understand that consistency is key when trying to change a behavior. Maladaptive behavior is defined by any person as a behavior that can be harmful to the success of an individual. The behaviors that we're going to be speaking a lot about in this presentation are going to be maladaptive behaviors, ones that we want to change, ones that we want to reduce. But behavior in general, we need to understand, is just like the word consequence. They can be good or they can be bad. A good consequence to eating a healthy diet is having a healthy body. A maladaptive behavior in terms of nutrition would be eating junk food all the time, not exercising. That would be considered a maladaptive behavior because it's harmful to the success of an individual. If an individual has major heart issues, diabetes, and even can develop cancer from unhealthy habits, then the success of the individual is at risk. And remember that behavior is a life necessity. Really, the foundation of every classroom's success drives itself upon the implementation of some type of behavioral intervention. It's very, very important to intervene more oftentimes on a proactive level than a reactive level, and we'll talk about that. But behavior is really a necessity for your Life Inc. classroom to be successful. What we plan to cover today, we're going to break down behavior into theory using a lot of terminology or lingo. We are going to be applying that behavior theory into scenarios once we get into part two. And we might have some time to focus on what happens in an educational model like Life Inc. Goal writing and accommodations we'll touch on, but not get into as in depth as the other topics. So this is a very basic sense of, of vernacular that pertains to behavior, behavior modification that relates to and its evolution. A lot of these terms are related in a sense. They just go through different iterations and almost different phases or trends in the behavior or science world of behavioral psychology. So right off the bat, we have those individuals like Skinner and 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 Pavlov and those are behavioral psychologists that started a lot of the behavioral talks about what's going on with a person based on the behavior that they're exhibiting and what we do to counteract that. When you hear terms like operant conditioning or classical conditioning, those are all psychology terms. The terms I'm going to give you today, some of them are scientific, but most of them are more applied in educational settings. So right off the bat, we have behavior modification. It's a very early version of ABA, which we'll get to in a minute. They use something called discrete trials, which is a very consistent repetition of trials over and over again. It's not much difference than today's recognized ABA or applied behavioral analysis. It's just one that was created by Ivar Lovaas a while back, and one that a term that's not typically displayed anymore. Behavior modification is seen as cold, although it's really the same thing. Um, it's just a little more repetitive and a little less. It involves a little less emotion, really. ABA, applied behavioral analysis, um, really best practice when you're talking about trying to change a behavior. We're going to talk about positive behavior support plans, and ABA overall is just this cycle of tracking a behavior, understanding it, defining it, describing it, and then taking that behavior, putting it into some type of plan to increase it or decrease it, and repeating it over and over again until you get the desired response, and then changing it slightly here and there based on the response to the intervention. RTI, response to intervention, almost the same thing, a little bit more less behavioral in a sense and more educational in a sense, but it's exactly basically the same thing as ABA. PBS, positive behavior support plan, that's the actual plan that's put in place that we are going to talk about in part two in depth. That positive behavior support plan are going to be things that you can create in your classroom. So we're not always reliant on a behavior analyst or an RBT. We want to be able to identify why a behavior is happening and put a plan in place in order to, again, make that behavior happen more or make that behavior happen less. An FBA, a functional behavior assessment, that is a document and is part of that positive behavior support plan. An FBA tracks an individual's behavior and at the end of it all defines why the behavior is happening. It's important. Sometimes you can do this very quickly. You don't need the document. But we always need to know why a person is doing what they are doing if we look to change what that person is doing. A behavior intervention plan, a BIP, very simply, a behavior intervention plan is the production of that functional behavior assessment. We understand the function from an FBA, and then we apply that in a BIP to then put specific interventions in place, sometimes proactively, sometimes reactively, so that an individual can change their behavior, again, either increase certain things, decrease certain things. And that's our goal with a behavior intervention plan. An ABC chart is a very simple document. It's used to track an individual's data. It can be used when we put an intervention in place or just to find a baseline. That is going to track an individual's antecedent, their behavior, and their consequence. We're going to go over what those terms mean. But an ABC chart is a great way of visually seeing why a person is doing what they're doing over the course of several ABCs. A BS, a behavior specialist, that is a non-trained school personnel. Basically, it's important to know who it is that you're speaking to sometimes. If you're doing these items, especially a positive behavior support plan in a team environment, you're going to want to know the players that you have in that team. A positive behavior support plan is created by that team and a potential team member, other than maybe a parent, classroom teacher, is a behavior specialist. Behavior specialists sometimes know their stuff and sometimes they know a little less about their stuff. And so it's important to understand that person might have some experience in the schools, but they don't really have any traditional training, any major background a lot of times. They might have come across a lot of students with disabilities or a lot of behaviors overall, but there's a range of abilities when it comes to behavior specialists. Now, a board certified behavior analyst, a BCBA, those individuals go to school for what they do. Again, you're going to have a range of individuals in doing how they do what they want to do. You have some that are more interested in the documentation of those behaviors and making pie charts. You have some more interested in wrestling on the floor with students when they have behaviors. So it's a real broad group, the BCBAs. A lot of times a BCBA has stepped out of the direct relationship with clients and rely on other aides to do that, other assistants. And that's why we have the RBTs right under the BCBAs. A registered behavior technician is an individual who is trained and then is overseen by a BCBA. Okay. So a lot of times, like for example, an occupational therapist will have an occupational therapist assistant, and the assistant is the person who's really boots on the ground, handling the individual and fulfilling that plan, while the OT is overseeing that. That's the same relationship as a BCBA and an RBT. Okay. They are overseeing what it is that's going on. So that's the basic lingo of some of those behavior pieces that we're going to be dealing with in part one. We're going to get right into it. I don't want to spend too much time on any one piece, but this is probably the most important slide out of any slide that we have here today that we're going to discuss. A, B, C, antecedent, behavior, and consequence. It's very, very important to understand this sequence, this, if you want to call it a math equation, because if we understand this, then we can basically break it down again with all of those fancy terms that we just saw, or just in our heads to understand why a person is doing what they're doing, and then to try to solve that through, like it says on the screen, proactive solutions or reactive interventions. So very simply, an antecedent is a stimulus that occurs prior to the action. What does that mean? That means that something is happening before the individual has a behavior. Okay. That's it. Something that happens before a behavior. I'm going to skip the middle and I'm going to go right to consequence. It's the exact opposite of the antecedents. It's a stimulus that occurs after the action. So if an antecedent occurs before the situation and a consequence happens after the action, then we have the behavior in the middle. And the behavior is the action. The behavior cannot be changed directly. And that's why we need the antecedent and the consequence in order to change the behavior through proactive solutions and reactive interventions. It's very, very important to understand the difference between the two. A proactive solution, why is it called a solution? Why is it called a proactive intervention? It's proactive. It happens before the behavior occurs. And if it's proactive, you don't have to intervene. It's a solution to the behavior. A solution ends the issue from happening. I used to have a camp counselor that said it's not a problem until it's a problem. Well, a proactive solution prevents the problem from happening. When you have a consequence and you're directly trying to influence the consequence instead of the antecedent, you're having a reactive intervention. That means you're waiting for the behavior to happen, and then you are reacting. And it's an intervention at that point because something has happened and you're trying to intervene. So it's very important to understand these are very simple words, words that you use throughout your daily vocabulary. But it's very, very important to understand that in behavioral theory, there are different ways to influence that behavior. And it's important to understand the timing of that. Antecedent, if you're influencing the antecedent, you are trying to create a proactive solution. If you are trying to manipulate that consequence, that's some that stimulus that occurs after the action, then you're putting forth a reactive intervention. Now we have a very simple term, reinforcement, punishment, positive, and negative. These are terms that you have probably used, and maybe you've used them right, maybe you've used them incorrectly. But what I'm going to do right now is give you just a minute to think in your head, what is the definition of reinforcement? If you're sort of that, that's a good thing. I want you to, also think about maybe what your definition of punishment is. Go ahead and think about that for just a short couple of seconds. Yeah. Either you've thought of those in your head or you've written those down, that's fine. But reinforcement and punishment are the same thing except one word. Okay. One word difference. Reinforcement is any stimulus that increases the probability that an individual will exhibit some behavior. Okay. So you are putting forth something. This is a reactive intervention. You are putting forth something, okay, that a person will do the behavior more. You're putting forth something so that a person will do something more. Okay, it increases the probability. What does that mean? That means that if somebody does a good thing and they get a cookie, they might continue to do good things. I'm not suggesting to give people cookies, and we'll get to that in a minute. But a stimulus is something that is presented, and reinforcement means that that stimulus will increase the probability that an individual will exhibit some behavior. Now, if it's only one word difference for punishment, what do you think that word is? The word goes from increases to decreases. Any stimulus that decreases the probability that an individual will exhibit some behavior. So, if a person does something good or bad and you slap their hand, I'm not suggesting you do that. We'll talk about that in a minute. But if you slap somebody's hand, that potentially will decrease the probability that an individual will exhibit some behavior. Now, those are very broad examples, and we're going to get into it a little bit more here. But I want you to understand how to use these terms correctly because it's extremely important for the next stages of what we are going to learn, both definitionally and in part two when you do the scenarios. When you talk about these things, as I mentioned before, they are both reactive. They are issued during the consequence phase of A, B, C, the previous slide. And learning will take effect when the individual knows if they will be reinforced or punished for their behavior. It will become almost this innate understanding and ability to perceive what's going to happen next. If you have a consistent approach to reinforcement or punishment of any behavior, that individual will know and that individual will act accordingly. And you will then have changed their behavior, not directly, but indirectly through reinforcement or punishment through that C, that consequence phase of ABC. Both are good, but planning is essential. Don't bet on luck. And what does that mean? Some people hear the word punishment, they think it's a bad thing. It's not. It's a good thing. Ignoring somebody who has an attention-seeking behavior that's inappropriate is the correct punishment for that person. And people will say, "Oh, ignoring somebody is not something that has to be accepted through a clinical review board." If you have a planned ignoring technique, some punishments, yes, you cannot withhold certain items from an individual. You can't take away certain items, and we'll talk about that. But a planned ignoring strategy with an individual who is attention seeking will punish them, and we'll get to that in a minute when we talk about functions. So they're both very, very good, and we need to understand how to use them appropriately. We need to plan when we use them, And that way, we won't need luck. We'll have science, we'll have psychology, and we'll have ABC on our side. A lot of people like to suggest that they know the meanings of positive and negative, like positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement. But positive and negative are very simple in the psychology world and the behavioral world. And that is the administration of some stimulus or the retraction of some stimulus. If it's positive reinforcement, it means that you are providing something to the person. We talked about that cookie. That would be a, an administration of a stimulus, the cookie, the retraction of some stimulus, taking away somebody's iPad or Game Boy, your child's toy, if they misbehave. If you take that away, it's a negative punishment. Okay, let's just really quickly um, use them in a way that sounds a little bit weird. A positive punishment would be like we said before when you slap somebody on the hand. You are administering the slap of the hand. Okay, and again, I'm using that as a very simple example. Don't use that in the classroom, but it's a simple way of understanding a positive punishment. You are providing something, whereas a negative punishment would be taking away something. In the same way, you say, well, how can things be reinforcing if you take them away? But there are many, many things that you can do to take something away and it be reinforcing. Okay. If an individual does work, and I have 10 questions on a page, and they do 5 very well within a reasonable amount of time, and I go ahead and remove the other 5, I say, you've done such a good job on the first 5. Don't worry about the second 5. Well, that could potentially be negatively reinforcing for somebody who didn't want to do the work to begin with. So it really does depend on the individual, whether it is reinforcing or punishing. Sometimes that slap of the hand that we talked about could be very reinforcing if the individual's function is sensory involved. And we are going to talk about that right now. It really does all come down to the function. If you realize our name is learning your function, the function is a very, very important part of behavior. The function, why a person exhibits a behavior, is the whole foundation of you intervening in a behavior through reinforcement and punishment. If you understand what the function is, then you can proactively solve problems and you can reactively solve problems. It's an amazing word. If you think about it as purpose or meaning, it's all of those things, but it is why a person exhibits that behavior. Or remember, behavior is that B of our ABC. We might not be able to change the behavior directly, but we will better influence if we understand why it is happening. The reason why a person exhibits a behavior, we mentioned that. The most important piece of the behavior puzzle, I think I just mentioned that as well. The function is what any behavioral intervention plan should center around. I mentioned that. And if the defined function is incorrect or unknown, behavior will not change. If you are trying to aim at a target and you don't know where that target is, you're not going to hit it. And the same is the case for behavior. If the behavior is what we're trying to change and the function is unknown, we will not change that behavior. It's just very cut and dry. Examples of functions. Very, very important to understand that functions are not vast if defined in a broad sense. They are very simple. The two functions that are present in people are usually getting something or getting away from something. So if we break them into those two parts very simply, we can understand them. That's the most broad way that you can break down the function of a behavior, getting something or getting away from something. So really quickly, getting something, usually attention, a tangible item, or some type of sensory input, breaking them down into those 3 things covers a lot of ground. There could be a different function. We're not going to touch too much on physiological functions because those ones are not really behaviorally involved or physiologically involved. And what does that mean? That means if a person is having an issue and it's because of a toothache, That shouldn't be dealt with behavioral interventions. That's not a behavioral thing. It's a physiological thing. It's not something that's going to be cured with behavioral interventions. So again, attention, tangible items, and sensory input are different functions that focus on somebody getting something, getting away from something, escape or avoidance. That's pretty obvious in that category. Obviously, in that category, getting away from something, escape, avoidance. Those are our functions that focus on getting away from something. So we have a behavioral example, and these are very simple ones that I wanted to do before we finish out the first section here of part one. Very simply, I'll move my box here so that you can see. It rains. A, antecedent. I want you to know those words, antecedent. It rains. B, you take out your umbrella. That's your behavior. That's the action. And C, the consequence of that is that you are dry. Okay? Simple. We can look at any behavior that we do in a day, as nebulous as it is, and we can break it down into ABC. A, the antecedent, a baby is hungry. And B, that baby cries. That's the action. C, the consequence, you probably feed the baby, or the baby gets fed in some way, shape, or form. A, B, C, antecedent, behavior, consequence. A, you have a headache. B, the action, you take aspirin, it's the behavior. And C, you feel better. You have relief from that headache. Whether that's from the placebo effect or not, I'll let you decide. The commonality of these three behavioral examples is that they each have an easily understood function. And I believe we're going to go over that right now. We go over again that first scenario about it raining, us taking out the umbrella, and you are dry. What is the function of that umbrella that we take out? We take out the umbrella. Why do we do that? What is the function? And if you guessed correctly, it would be escape avoidance from the water. We don't want to get rained on. And so therefore we take out our umbrella. Okay. And remember, we're using that escape avoidance. We want to get away from something. If a baby's hungry and a baby cries and you feed the baby, what is the function of the baby? Well, it's a tangible item. It's a food. The baby wants food. And so that baby is crying over getting something, not getting away from something, but getting something. If in turn the baby cried and you fed the baby and it kept crying and it had a dirty diaper, then it would have been escape avoidance from the dirty diaper or sensory, trying to get away from the sensory aspects of that. And last but not least, you have a headache, you take the aspirin and you feel better. Very simply, you're escaping, avoiding that headache. You want that headache to go away. So very simply, that's the end of part one. I hope it wasn't too much. I do want you to take a break. I want you to think about those things that we talked about. Maybe you took notes. Maybe you want to review some of those definitions. I do have, at the end of all this, a little exam, a little comprehension check, and you'll be utilizing a lot of the terms that we did on that comprehension check. Apply your new knowledge to the part one comprehension check. I just mentioned that. And if you want to hang on to your part one comprehension check after you finish it, I want you to use it during part two. There are some things on there that will help you as we start breaking down scenarios for some of our students. We're right about to the 30-minute mark, which was exactly how long I wanted to do this. So I hope you guys had fun, and we'll see you real soon. I'm just going to close out.